Actually, I do have a little bit more on the beaver and so forth. And back in those days, there was a period of time when the only people that could trap beavers were like government trappers and or somebody that the government would hire. So it was illegal for my dad and his partner to buy beavers, but they still did because there was a lot of trappers here, and so they would buy them and bootleg them out of here into Wyoming, where it was legal, and that was kind of scary stuff. And I was pretty little, but I remember a few experiences that was interesting. And Mr. Hawkins had sent a bundle of beaver back to New York to be sold, and the FBI picked up on it and came back to him, and this was during the war when it started, and they came back to him and they nailed him, and it was either go to prison or join the service. That's how he ended up in the service. But he was lucky that he was a pilot, and they made an officer out of him right away. So, and a lot of that went on back during the war. If you had a felony or something, it was either the war or prison. And so that's how he ended up there. And when I was about probably in junior high, we had what I always called the Lincoln Street Raid. My dad had bought a bunch of beaver from a friend that he knew and trusted, and we lived on Lincoln Street. And he brought the beaver into the house, bought them from him, but the guy was a setup for the game and fish, for the game wardens. He really was. And so the next thing we knew, our whole house was surrounded with game wardens. And they were from out of Steamboat and all over. And that they kept wanting to know why they couldn't go in the house and take a look. And my dad told him, and he probably shouldn't have, but he told me, he said, well, my wife has a bad heart, and she didn't. And so they called the doctor to come down. And when the doctor, and I was standing there when this happened, I'll never forget it. When the doctor came through the door, one of the game wardens tried to follow him in, and my mother hit him over the head with a broom. Anyway, so this was going to be a long day. And back in those days, the game and fish, or the game wardens, didn't have much law on their side. And to say, for instance, they needed a search warrant to get in the house, and the only time that they could search, even with the search warrant, was during the daylight hours. They couldn't go in after dark. And so they insisted that they get a search warrant, or that's what they wanted to do. But when they came downtown to get a search warrant, the sheriff and whoever could serve the search warrants, I think they were bootleggers too, because they left town. And they had to drive all the way to Steamboat to get a search warrant. And back in those days, that was a long trip from Craig to Steamboat. And they got back to town. It was in the evening, and my dad was in the courthouse with them. And he had to sign the search warrant and so forth. And he walked outside, and from the courthouse to Lincoln Street's a pretty good walk. And they opened the door and told him to get in the vehicle. He said, no, I don't trust you guys, I'm going to walk. Well, he was wasting time so it would get dark. And by the time he got home, it was dark, and they couldn't come in the house. So my dad and my uncle that was in that picture there with all the coyotes spent all night in our house burning beavers. And it was in the spring of the year. It was kind of warm. And I can still kind of imagine that odor that we had a big coal fireplace. And my dad was a little ornery. We had Venetian blinds. And every time he would burn a beaver, he'd go over and he would show it through those Venetian blinds and shove it in the fireplace. Well, in the morning when they burned all the beaver, it was all over with, everybody went home. I'll never forget that. That was quite a tale. That tale lasted a long time around Craig. But so those were the fun days. in 55 when I joined the service. And I rode on that train out to Denver. And I got a little story along with that. You know, I'd never seen a TV then because we didn't have them over here. And I got on that train, and that seat, it was not soft. It was made out of wood. And it was quite a trip. But back in those days, I think I probably did a little partying all night and didn't get much sleep. So I slept a lot of the time going over. But when we hit the top of Corona, and I could look out and see, that's quite a trip. Really it is. That's a beautiful trip. So I rode that train out. And then I joined the service, so I didn't ride it again. But back during the war, now my dad and a lot of people that are still living around here, and some that aren't, that's the way they went to Denver to be inducted in, was on the train down here. Yeah, that was quite a trip. And I used to know all the switchmen and so forth. A lot of them lived over in, I believe, Pittsburgh and down at Bond, but they would ride the train up here to do all the work and go back. And I even played a little poker down there when I was buying hides, down at the Roundhouse at, I'm saying Bond, wherever it was at. But I would stay down there and go down and play poker with them. And they were fun. But I knew them all. Point on the beavers, and this made me a little bit sick about it. My dad too. Most all your beaver trappers knew how to skin a beaver. Back in the old days, that's what I'm going to call them. In later years, they set up a situation where anybody could go shoot a beaver and bring it down to the warehouse, and they'd skin them down there. Well, I didn't like that because I thought that was hard on the beavers, because everybody was out shooting them. And that wasn't, to me, that wasn't fair. I always thought that you had to trap them right and this and that. Now, when I got out of the service, see, we didn't really have coons in this part of the country when I went in the service. But when I came out, evidently the Game and Fish had planted them in here. And out near where the other museum is out there, I was trapping on the river one day, and I went down there, and all the willows were tore up, and it was really a mess around there, and I couldn't figure out what in the world's wrong here. And I got up there, and there was a coon in my trap. I had never seen one in this part of the country, and he was vicious. So I didn't want to shoot him, kill him, because I didn't want to hold him to hide. And I was dumb enough to try to drown him. Well, you don't drown a coon. I finally had to shoot him so I could get him out of there. And then my dad told me that they transplanted him in this part of the country, and they grew. And so I always thought that was kind of interesting. Coons are tough. I was taking care of some oil wells up on the mountain over here, and my kids were about your age then, and there was a couple of baby coons up there, and I caught them. And I had to use welding gloves to get a hold of them, and they were real tiny, but they were tough. And I brought them home, and I eventually taught them, or fed them with a little milk bottle and so forth. And one of them disappeared, but we raised one, and he got big, and my oldest son used to walk around with him on his shoulder all the time. And that always worried me, because I was always scared that a dog might come along and try to get to the coon, and the coon would probably tear my son's head up or something, trying to save himself. But that was always interesting. But we finally took it up to our cabin later years, because we'd seen coons up there. We let it go up there. And then we also had pet skunks. That's a different story. I was coming into town from, I don't know, the oil field or something one night. My wife called me, and she said, I got a surprise. And I told her, I said, well, I'll meet you down to Cosgriff, the old Cosgriff Hotel down here, and we'll have a drink. She came down, and these people had given her this little baby skunk. And she had on a fur coat, and she walked through front door, and there was a guy on the telephone, and she said the skunk looked out and looked at him, and the guy just totally forgot what he was doing. So she brought it into the bar. This was back in the old days when we could do things. We did things a little different. And she brought it into the bar, and I met her there, and I thought, oh my God, what have we got now? And everybody in the bar played with that skunk for hours in there. But skunks aren't easy to raise. They still have a little odor even after you deodorize them. And he would all day long, he never knew where he was at in the house because they're nocturnal, they hunt at night. But at nighttime, she had a big lard can on the back porch, and the skunk would get on top of that can and beat on it, trying to scare bugs out and so forth, and that's what they wanted. Or he'd tap on the floor. So we didn't get a lot of sleep all the time we had him. But he disappeared, or it, well, I can't remember what it was. And my kids went hunting for it. And they got a hold of the wrong skunk. And that wasn't good. And my wife had to bathe them in tomato juice. That's the only thing we knew, and so forth, to get rid of that. So all I could do is laugh at it now.